Hello, welcome back, panelists.
Thank you.
And welcome everyone back to the 4th Annual Latin America Energy Conference for our final 2 sessions of the day. I think this is going to be a very interesting session. As you all know, the US presidential election is coming up very soon on November 3rd. And issues related to energy and particularly climate change have featured prominently in policy discussions and questions that have been raised for the candidates. Most of the focus, of course, has been on domestic issues, which voters are most focused on, but both of the candidates do have positions on international energy policy. And the outcome of the election will shape the US's policies toward Latin America, including on many energy-related issues. So today I'm very excited to start our panel with 2 experts who can discuss the outlook for specific Latin America-related energy policy issues under the 2 scenarios of a second Trump administration or a Biden administration. And so I will kick off this discussion with a series of questions for the 2 speakers once I introduce them. And then we should have time later on for questions from the audience. So I'm very pleased to welcome George David Banks, who is the former Special Assistant to President Donald Trump in the area of international energy and environment. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you. Great to be here.
And I also want to introduce David Goldwyn. He is the former Special Envoy and Coordinator for International Energy Affairs from 2009 to 2011 at the US State Department. So each of these officials, former officials, are here in their personal roles. I want to mention, they're speaking in their personal capacities. We've invited them because of their experience with each of the administrations, but they in no way represent the campaigns of either candidate, nor are they speaking for Congress. They're speaking in their personal capacities. So let's get started. For the first question, President Trump's energy policy has centered on the idea of energy dominance, including a big focus on oil and gas exports from the United States. But since 4 years ago, the scenario has changed quite a bit. Prices have declined sharply this year. Global demand has also taken a hit because of the coronavirus pandemic. So my first question for Dave Banks is, do you think that in a second Trump administration, would the focus alter in any way given this new reality?
No, thanks. And again, it's great to be here. Really appreciate the opportunity. But look, I mean, I think the administration in a second term would probably double down on the policy. Let's step back a little, and let's keep in mind that in 2017, we did work to define what the energy dominance agenda meant. Because there were a lot of questions, what is this sort of thing? We had a lot of concerns expressed from our foreign partners. They were like, well, does this mean you guys were trying to dominate us? And it's like, oh, no, that's not the point at all. It's really about, I think it's really about the United States increasing, maximizing its production and export of US energy, resources and technologies, right? So sort of cutting across all the energy forms. So, and while the administration's moves on fossil fuels have clearly received the most attention, there have been pretty recent notable reforms to other sort of technology export programs, including civil nuclear energy. The U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, for example, can now support nuclear power projects. And that's, we can talk about, exactly what role does the U.S. play in a global civil nuclear program, but it's clear that we need to make certain types of reforms and sort of rethink some of the ways that we have traditionally looked at some of these issues, including civil nuclear power. But I see the second term Trump administration continuing to work on civil nuclear energy and related exports. XM, the Export-Import Bank, has also become pretty active in sort of the clean energy space, and it's definitely stepped up its focus on renewables, for example. And look, I think one of the things that I think it's important to note is that there's definitely a strong possibility that supply chain security issues and their role in energy trade would receive more attention. That might be the case in any scenario, whether it's Trump or Biden. But President Trump has had a couple of executive orders on critical minerals, one just here maybe last week. But the issue has grown in importance on the Hill as well. And of course, there's going to be a lot of focus on creating the domestic supply, either through mining, innovation and substitutes, or recycling. But the importance of supply chain security in critical minerals, I think, will have an impact on how we, including the Republican Party, how we view renewable technology exports as well. I think they're likely to grow in strategic value in a second term for Trump. But again, I think sort of the same thing. I'll let David speak to that, but I would expect the same thing to happen in any political scenario.
Okay, so yeah, the energy dominance, it goes beyond oil and gas exports alone. And so regardless of what's happening in oil and gas export markets, these other issues are still very important.
Precisely.
So David Goldwyn, let's turn to you. And I also, you can feel free to comment on what was said before. And I also wanted to ask you specifically whether you think natural gas exports to Latin American and Caribbean countries would continue to be a big focus if Biden were to win, because there was a big push for natural gas exports, especially to Central America and the Caribbean, under the Obama administration. That has continued under the Trump administration, but Biden is more, I think, ambitious on climate change. So do you think that he would say, we really just need to focus on renewables, or do you think natural gas exports would continue to be an important focus?
Yes, thanks for the question, Lisa, and congratulations on holding the event even under COVID times. As you've got fantastic participation, so a real credit to you all. And Dave, good to see you as always. Will natural gas continue to be a big focus, or it will be exclusively renewables? I think the main focus for Vice President Biden is going to be beating COVID first, reviving the economy second, addressing systemic racism and racial justice, including environmental justice third, and then addressing the climate crisis fourth. In the climate context, that means crafting a U.S. nationally determined commitment. And that will really depend, that the nature of that pathway will depend on whether Democrats take the Senate or not, but it's going to have higher ambitions, and he's going to focus on mainstreaming climate issues into foreign policy. So in that context, natural gas will remain important. When countries like Mexico, who have binding greenhouse gas commitments and have their own NDCs, have natural gas as a part of making that energy transition and decarbonizing their economy, I think a Biden administration is going to support it. So I think it's going to be in that context. Natural gas is a backup for hydro in Brazil. It's helpful also in Chile and Argentina and other countries. And so they're not going to be against natural gas. Will they be cheerleading for natural gas and going to countries saying buy our gas? Probably not. Does that actually do any good, or do countries just buy on price? I think that's probably the case anyway. So I don't know that it makes a big difference. And they will be cheerleading for clean energy exports to the extent we are making those resources here at home. I think there will be some frictions in the hemisphere, though, in this context. Clearly, Mexico is not living up to its NDC, and it is disfavoring renewable generation on oil and gas production, for that matter, as well, by stopping permits in both of those places. So there's going to be some conversations with Mexico about their climate commitment. There'll be some hard conversations with Brazil as well about what it's doing. I think there's a diplomacy win-win strategy there. We want both countries to prosper economically. And so there might be a way to combine those two efforts. But I think that's going to be an important focus. And I think there's going to be a lot of diplomacy on getting the framework right in this, not only in the Caribbean and in Central America, but in other countries, so that they are investable for clean energy. And I think things like DFC have been a tremendous addition, and we'll use the other multilateral development banks as well. So I think gas will be part of the mix, but it won't be either or, renewables or natural gas. And I think critical minerals will continue to be an important part of U.S. energy diplomacy.
So, and what do you think of Dave's comments? So you agree that these, the whole energy supply chain, critical minerals would also continue to be important?
Yeah, it is going to continue to be important for manufacture here. And not to go too far out of the region, but it's going to be important in a couple of ways. One is there's going to be a lot of R&D in trying to create synthetic critical minerals, so we're not necessarily reliant on certain countries for them. Our conversations with China will be immensely complex. China's role in Latin America, cyber election interference, and so how we engage with China on climate, how we engage on clean energy exports, what we do about tariffs, and how critical minerals fit into that conversation will be relevant. But I think we will be encouraging, as we have with Canada. That was another great agreement, I think, the US-Canada agreement on critical minerals. I think we will continue to be engaging on that diplomatically and having diversity of supply as we used to with oil and gas when we lived in the age of scarcity. The greatest number of supply from the greatest number of countries will be important, but I think we're also going to try and figure out if there's a way other than mining critical minerals that we can solve this problem.
Mm-hmm. And let me ask you a follow-up question about Mexico and Canada that you mentioned. The two countries are, of course, the most important trade partners in energy for the United States, and exports of natural gas and refined products to Mexico have remained steady under President López Obrador, even though he's indicated that his goal is to increase Mexico's own production and reduce reliance on the US. And then in Canada, US crude imports coming from Canada also remain strong, even though there's been infrastructure bottlenecks. So David Goldwyn, we'll start with you. How do you think Biden would deal with AMLO's energy policies? His policies are focused on reducing private investment, and ultimately they're hurting US companies there. So how do you think the Biden administration would deal with that? And do you think Biden would look to resume some of the trilateral cooperation initiatives that were undertaken, under the Obama administration?
Sure. No, thanks for that question. First, I would say I really don't understand how President López Obrador is going to accomplish the objectives of growing Mexico's independence and autonomy and strengthening Pemex and CFE through the pathway that he is taking. It is much more likely to result in kind of economic suicide and, in fact, an erosion of the creditworthiness and the capacity of CFE and Pemex if they can't partner with private companies and get more capital and get more technology. I don't get it, and I don't think it's working. That said, the United States has a broad agenda with Mexico. We have, security cooperation, we have immigration issues, we have trade, and we have energy. And it's going to be a close relationship. It's going to be a respectful relationship on the part of the United States. And we will have our priorities, and we'll have our arguments. I think a Biden administration is going to want Mexico to live up to its Paris commitments, and it's going to have a conversation about how that's going to happen. It's the law of the land in Mexico, even if it isn't being enforced right now. And so, President López Obrador is making his policy. It's not about us. It's about populism and nationalism there. So that'll be a hard conversation. I think the energy trade will continue because Mexico wants it and needs it. In fact, as you pointed out, natural gas exports to Mexico are really at a record high right now. So I think that's going to be important, and the U.S. is going to want under Biden Mexico to increase its ambitions. So we'll have that conversation. I think the U.S. always enforces the rule of law, and I think they will want USMCA to be enforced. Does that mean whether the concerns of oil and gas companies are going to be number one on the agenda? I don't think they're going to single people out, but I think enforcing USMCA is going to be important. The labor provisions, the environmental provisions, all of the provisions. So I think that's important. I think trilateral engagement will continue, or will, I think there's been some of it. It'll resume the three amigos as it was in the Obama days. We have energy integration to talk about. We have, sharing research and development. We have sharing data. So I think that will continue. It will be important. And so I'm not really worried about the U.S.-Mexico trade. With Canada, Canada has been such a reliable part of U.S. energy security for decades. We've got electricity trade, we've got gas trade, we've got oil trade, and we've got lots of cooperation on clean energy technology. The oil trade is going to be complicated. It's going to be complicated because new infrastructure is going to be subject to new tests for offsets and measuring direct, indirect, and cumulative emissions, and because heavy oil is disfavored. And I think Vice President Biden has said we're going to have a process for approving permits, but if you applied that process now, Keystone probably wouldn't get approved. So I think heavy oil will be an issue, but I think the rest of it will be fine. I can't say that I know that things are going to go better with Mexico under Vice President Biden than they have under President Trump. We certainly won't be insulting them. We won't be dealing with immigration issues by putting children in cages, but President Lopez Obrador is doing what he's doing for his own reasons. It really isn't about us. So I don't know if he's going to be any more inclined to listen to us than he was to President Trump, but we will have a diplomatic approach and a full relationship. So my hope is that we will find a better path forward. But the economic direction in Mexico is bad and getting worse. And until Mexicans decide that they don't like the way it's going, I don't know there's a whole lot that the United States can do about it.
Interesting. And Dave Banks, do you think that Canada and Mexico would remain strong energy trade partners under a second Trump administration? What do you think the administration's position would be over the next 4 years on this difficult issue of pipeline infrastructure from Canada?
Yeah, good question. And just I would probably echo some of the points that David made, as to what the facts are on the ground in Mexico, and how much of a disappointment it's been, right? When I think there were a number of us who were pretty excited about continued integration of the energy markets between the United States and Mexico, and the progress that Mexico had made. But yeah, I mean, of course, as David said, the relationship is going to be very good, very solid on energy trade. That's going to continue, if Trump wins the second term. Look, the president understands, and going back to this sort of energy dominance concept, the president understands that the energy dominance agenda that the administration's been pushing does depend on continued integration of the North American energy market. And I'd probably even potentially go kind of outside of that and talk about sort of integration of North America and Latin America. There's been a significant amount of work across the agencies in this space. Hasn't got a tremendous amount of visibility in the press, but Treasury, Department of Energy, State, and others, I mean, they're continuing some of this focus in promoting the integration, not just with Canada and Mexico, but also with Latin America in general. I was very much involved in that first year in 2017 in trying to negotiate an agreement with the former administration in Mexico that aimed to substantially increase the integration of the markets. But of course, the effort was abandoned with the election, and then again became focused on other Latin American and Caribbean nations. So, and the administration has actually been pretty successful in pulling that together. Again, it's been fairly quiet and below the radar, but they actually have made some pretty good progress. Look, I mean, from a strategic perspective, and this is related to climate, there is a recognition that we, the United States, we need access to Canadian and Mexican ports to export U.S. energy, in part because we've got states on the West Coast and the Northeast that actively work to block the export of U.S. fossil fuels, despite their relative GHG benefits compared to similar fuels produced by other countries. So, yes, I think that, and that point is not often discussed, but clearly in a second term Trump administration, you would have that continued focus.
Thank you. And I would like to ask you a follow-up question. To what extent do you think there will be an intersection between trade and energy policy? So, the trade, under the trade negotiations with China, there was a deal that the U.S. would be able to export more LNG to China. Under USMCA, there were efforts to protect U.S. investments, for example, in the oil and gas sector through state dispute settlement mechanisms. So do you think that trade and energy and international energy policy will continue to be closely linked?
So this is one of my favorite topics, by the way. So thank you. And we didn't even coordinate.
And I didn't plan that one.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I would broaden it out. I would broaden it out to sort of the intersection between trade, energy, climate, and supply chain security issues, right? And it's not just, even if you were to have a second term Trump administration, you're still going to have you're still going to have more and more of a conversation here in the United States on that point, in part because of what the EU is doing in pushing forward with a border carbon adjustment, a carbon tariff essentially, right? That would try to reduce emissions leakage and level the playing field for their domestic industry that face a carbon constraint. But yeah, no, I think that there's no question that that these policies are very much connected, you know, and the supply chain security stuff when it comes to these energy technologies, for example, and of course, you know, we use critical minerals for in a lot of different ways, right? A lot of different applications. But the climate stuff too will become more and more integrated in the conversation. I don't know exactly how a second term Trump administration would react to the climate piece. I think obviously they wouldn't agree with it and they would push back on it. But having said all that, you know, there's growing work out there and analyses that point to how much cleaner U.S. production is and manufacturing is in general, sort of across all the sectors, than a lot of our competitors. So a notable exception with Europe, Japan, even Brazil. Brazil's actually fairly close to the average that the U.S. has because of its hydro. But I think, yes, I think that is the future of the policy. And I think it'll be really interesting to watch it evolve, regardless of who wins the election.
Interesting. Well, I'll go to the next question. I want to focus more on policy towards Central America and the Caribbean, which under President Trump has been heavily focused on encouraging U.S. companies to invest in the energy sectors in these countries, mostly through the Americas Crece program. And then prior to that, under the Caribbean Energy Security Initiative back in 2015, Biden, as vice president, promoted energy integration in the Caribbean and Central America. So David Goldwyn, let's start with you. What do you expect? You know, obviously Biden has a lot of experience in this particular topic, but then, you know, a lot has happened in the last couple of years. And so what would you expect his energy strategy towards Central America and the Caribbean to be focused on? What would it involve? Would Biden focus on U.S. lending for development of infrastructure in Latin America and the Caribbean? And if so, how would this be different from what's happening currently under America Crece and the DFC?
Sure. You know, thank you. And I want to talk about Central America and the Caribbean. I just can't help but go back and just in response to some of what Dave had to say, note that that essentially the tariff policy and the trade policy has been a serious headwind for U.S. Gas and oil exports, mostly by closing the Chinese market because of the retaliatory tariffs, and a carbon border adjustment might result in, you know, in more tariffs. So so I think if you're concerned about exports, energy dominance is one thing, but the result is that the tariff wars have been a real hardship for the U.S. export industry. But on Central America and Caribbean, I mean, as you rightly point out, Lisa, it's been a long time interest of the vice president. It comes from his analysis that the best way to reduce the migration pressure coming particularly from the Northern Triangle, but also from some parts of the Caribbean, you know, is not to separate families at the border, but it's to deal with those factors and promote economic development in those areas. And that's what the Caribbean Energy Security Initiative, which was then expanded to Central America, produced. Climate is also going to be a major factor in the Caribbean. It's going to be about climate resilience. How do you build back infrastructure that can withstand hurricanes? And there has been a lot of progress. I think there have been, as the recent dialogue that you all put out, I think just this week on programs, the Inter-American Dialogue Advisor well points out, it was really a terrific analysis. There's a lot of programs, they're not especially well coordinated. And so I think that's really what the next step is, to try and bring all this together. Lending is an issue, and so I think more of that will absolutely continue through DFC and also through the Inter-American Development Bank. But the issue in most of these countries is that they're not creditworthy, or you don't have an investable framework. So you've got to pull all this together, diplomacy to get the framework right, to have the capital available, and then to have an investable project. It's not a problem of lack of capital. And I think we're pushing on an open door in the region, because I think the governments have done a tremendous amount at the CARICOM level and other places, you know, CSERMs, there are a number of programs there trying to move to more investable frameworks. But it's a very heterogeneous region. You know, geothermal is appropriate in some areas, solar in other areas, gas backing up wind in other areas. There's not a lot of real estate in a lot of these places, and so so wind is not always an option onshore, but it might be offshore. So I think that's going to be the issue. What you'll see from Biden, I think, is just more of an integrated approach because it is a priority. It's going to be a pretty tightly coordinated foreign policy team anyway. So I think trying to have a real partnership and bring all these programs together, framework, lending, you know, and diplomacy will be, you know, will be the hallmark of a Biden approach to the region.
Okay, I see. And Dave, what do you think about, how focused do you think a second Trump administration would be on promoting US investment in infrastructure in Latin America, as well as other regions around the world? And I also want to ask you if you think they're supporting Congress for further extending loans and aid and infrastructure overseas to counter China's influence, because of course this, you know, depends on the president, but it also, Congress also has a role. So I wonder if you have any thoughts there.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I mean, look, and by the way, the activity almost always depends on staffing, right? So we currently have, you know, folks again in the agencies, particularly in Treasury, who are very, very active in this space. So yeah, I mean, I would expect those efforts to continue, maybe even in a more increased or more focused way. Look, there's a lot of support, not only within the administration, but I think in town, in the Congress, for helping Latin American nations access private investment for energy, roads, ports, airport projects, leveraging existing programs. And we've talked about DFC, but USAID is also very much engaged in this space. You know, the administration, the Trump administration has pushed countries in the region to improve their regulatory frameworks, their procurement strategies or structures. And look, I mean, there's no question that this is related to China's Belt and Road Initiative. I think there was a lot of concern about the lack of transparency and how some projects were awarded to the Chinese and energy and mining at the Chinese companies, again, in a very opaque manner. So yes, and I would argue that this is a broader U.S. national interest and would cut across the political spectrum, you know, for the U.S. to be more actively engaged in helping promote private sector investment and transparency to counter what we would consider to be growing Chinese influence in parts of Latin America. As many of folks know who are joining us today, China's clearly become a focus of policymaking here in the States. That was already in the works before COVID, but it's even more important now, particularly in going back to our brief conversation on supply chain security issues. So yeah, so I definitely see a continued interest from not only kind of an economic and diplomacy perspective, but again, focus on the geopolitics and competition with the Chinese.
David, do you think that under Biden there would be such a focus on countering Chinese influence?
I think so. I think we want to, you know, compete in a fair way. But I think having transparent projects, I think, as Dave points out, is going to be important. You know, access to capital. I think the concern is not so much whether China's financing transmission, but it's how they're doing it. And some of the experiences, loaning money to Jamaica and then kind of owning the road, you know, has proven to be just a new form of imperialism, which these countries are resistant to. So I think it will be an important priority. I think one of the things that a Biden administration will have to consider is whether, you know, sort of a CCTPP plus, you know, whether rejoining some sort of trade arrangement with strong labor and environmental provisions, maybe even climate-focused provisions, is a better way of containing China than trying to outspend them, because we're never going to generate enough money to do that. So there are lots of ways to compete, and I think that's, frankly, China overall is going to be the #1 foreign policy challenge for any new administration. But I think competing in the region will be part of it.
Before I go to my next question, I just want to mention to the audience that we will have time to take some questions from the audience. So if you would like to raise any questions, you can send them to the Q&A or you can email them to us and we'll take them that way if you're watching through YouTube. So my next question that I think another topic that's very important to discuss on US energy policy is sanctions. So oil sanctions have been used extensively by the Trump administration to counter US adversaries, including Iran, Venezuela, Russia. So Dave Banks, let's start with you with a more kind of broad global look. Would you expect the US to maintain or even step up sanctions pressure under a second Trump presidency? And again, you know, how would that how would Congress be involved in any of that type of decision?
Yeah, I don't see a change in the policy. You know, and I'm a skeptic of sanctions policy in general as to the effectiveness of it. But it's relatively easy to do, right? And it's kind of a popular policy to sort of push, just, you know, from a U.S. perspective. So I don't see the administration changing its approach to sanctions. And then in Congress, I mean, in general, Congress has been not only supportive of the different regimes, but if anything, kind of pushing the administration, particularly as it pertained to Russia, of course. But pushing the administration for even tougher sanctions. And I'd point out, like, at least in the case of Venezuela, there's the Trump administration has certainly has its hawks who've been supportive of potentially like a military intervention. And there's been some folks on the Hill that have expressed concerns about the potential unauthorized use of the U.S. military in places like Venezuela. So yeah, so I would just say there's a little bit of nuance there, right, in supporting the sanctions regime, but also the Congress supporting the sanctions regime, but also having concerns about potential intervention by a second-term Trump administration. Yeah.
And do you think that there might even be stepping up sanctions on Venezuela under a second Trump administration?
Yeah, maybe. Look, I mean, the way these things work, it depends on the political dynamic, right? You could have a scenario where tougher sanctions are definitely tabled and gain widespread support across sort of the executive office, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think there's always that possibility.
Okay, great. So David, what do you think a Biden administration would do on sanctions policy? I think it's more, you know, given that Trump is the sitting president, you know, we can foresee some sort of continuation. Obviously, there's more unknowns with the new president. Do you think he would reverse the oil sanctions that haven't succeeded in ousting Maduro? What do you think his approach would be?
Well, I think with respect to Venezuela, all administrations love economic sanctions. It's when you don't have a military option, it's the tool of choice. And, you know, as the case with Russia, if you have an administration that you don't think is putting enough pressure on the country, then it's the way Congress can intervene. But with respect to Venezuela, I would hope that a Biden administration would take a fresh look at the Venezuela policy, because we have maximum pressure and a humanitarian catastrophe, and Maduro is as entrenched as ever. So this policy is not working. The international coalition is fracturing. The EU has its own mission going down to Venezuela to try and deal with things. And the consequences are felt by the states on Venezuela's border. So mass migration is not helpful for them either. So you need pressure and diplomacy. And I think the diplomacy piece is missing, and some of this has been about Florida. And so after the election, freed of that, I think who knows what a Trump administration might do, but I think a Biden administration is going to try and look at what works. The point about sanctions, when you have them, you want an off-ramp, and the off-ramp is for the end game that you're trying to achieve with the sanctions. So that's release of political prisoners, a real electoral process, access to the media, and a contestable election. Whether you insist on regime change is really a different matter. But also, you're not going to solve the Venezuela problem unless you deal with what's going to happen to the military. So having a strategy for dealing with, what happens to the military and why should they leave will be important. That's missing from the current strategy right now. You have to deal with Russia and China and to some extent Iran, and maybe negotiations with Iran change the dynamic for Maduro if we are engaging with those countries and changing the degree to which they are willing to be supportive of the Maduro regime. So, I think it's going to be part of a roadmap, but I would think that a Biden administration will take a fresh look. And I think if you are, if you get some of those steps along the way for the roadmap, that's traditional diplomacy, then there could be sanctions relief that might come as a result of taking serious, credible, verifiable steps towards a real election. But I don't think they're going to get something for nothing. And I don't expect any relief until there's, important movement on the part of the regime.
Mm-hmm. So you think discussions with Iran could actually influence policy toward Venezuela as well?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, the approach to Iran is not going to be just about the JCPOA. There's going to have to be a conversation about other issues, but, making more trouble is not going to help solve that problem. So I think it's it's a tool in the toolbox.
Mm-hmm. Well, my next question, I think a very important topic to discuss is climate change. It's, I would say, been one of the campaign issues where Trump and Biden most clearly differ. So Dave Banks, let's start with you. What will be the Republican Party's position on climate change over the next 4 years? Will anything change? You sort of briefly mentioned, but I wonder if you could tell us more about where you think climate policy is going, whether Trump will take further steps to roll back Obama-era climate regulations, and are there any differences between Trump and Republican members of Congress on international climate issues?
Well, I'll get my crystal ball out. Interesting question. Look, there's clearly been a shift amongst congressional Republicans in how they talk about climate change in the Senate and in the House. And that's for a number of reasons. I think, we've got those folks who accept the science and want to commit to some type of action. You've got members who recognize that the current position is a political liability for the GOP, just given where younger, conservative-leaning voters are, where independents are. Look, at least in the House, control of the chamber requires winning a critical mass of suburban districts, of purple districts, and that's easier with a good message on climate. So there's definitely politics are definitely driving some of this shift in the conversation around climate. But then, look, you've got members who represent energy-intensive manufacturing or fossil fuel districts, and they recognize that they need to respond to what they consider as democratic policies that are detrimental to U.S. interests, particularly as they pertain to fossil fuels. And so there is some of that response as well. So it's a combination of stuff, but it is worth noting that the GOP House leader, Kevin McCarthy, he was actively pushing a climate initiative before the pandemic derailed everything. But this was the first time that GOP House leadership really embraced the climate policy initiative. So it's noteworthy for that reason. But you've had a fair amount of activity in the Senate. But let's be clear, congressional Republicans are largely starting from scratch in how they define a public approach to climate change. We currently have what I would consider to be a baseline policy that's largely defined by technology and innovation. So I would expect, during this course of 4 years that we're talking about, to be a further evolution of Republican policy on the Hill, but particularly if Biden wins. I think that would also drive and create more momentum for that conversation. Look, I've long argued that President Trump is not an ideologue on climate change. He doesn't believe in it necessarily. He's pretty public about his skepticism, but he's not. He doesn't oppose climate change for the sake of opposing climate change and because it's about CO2. He views it through the lens of, what's the impact on U.S. competitiveness, on manufacturing, the broader economy. It's very much kind of a Kyoto Protocol type of response. Points dating back to that period. But again, I get these questions from time to time. Could there be a potential shift on climate in a second term? Yes, but a lot of this, the vast majority of this, is determined by staffing, right? Staffing is incredibly important. You're not with the current staffing, you're not gonna have a shift on the policy. And I seriously doubt if the president would just do it alone, right? Just from his Twitter account. But I will say this, I do think, let's go back to this climate trade piece. And by the way, back to David's point about carbon tariffs hurting U.S. fossil fuels exports, not necessarily, right? It depends. We can, I'll bring up a point on that here in a bit. But look, I do think that there is a potential sweet spot here if, you know, more and more people are becoming educated. When I mean more and more people, I'm talking about sort of Republican policy makers. They're becoming more and more educated on, you know, where the U.S. stands, you know, with decarbonization. We're certainly on a decarbonization trend. You can argue that that may not be enough, but we are on a decarbonization trend. And that is very, very different than where we were with Kyoto, when emissions were projected to do this, right? And we were expected to cut way below where they were expected to be. But in this case, you know, we're on the decarbonization trend. And if you have, I think, more analytical work, you know, in this space, I think it'll only sort of reinforce what we kind of know already, that in general, U.S. production, manufacturing across the sectors is cleaner from a GHG perspective than a lot of our competitors. So again, just given the president's focus on manufacturing and trade, if he knew that you could potentially use climate change to create a competitive advantage in trade, I mean, he might view it as a jiu-jitsu move right against the Chinese. And I agree with David that in order to check China and other parts of the world, it's good to sort of weave in the climate piece as well. Look, on international climate policy, there's not a tremendous amount of attention given to it, you know, outside of the Paris Agreement. I mean, even in the Democratic staff report on the House side, there wasn't a tremendous amount of detail on international climate policy. You know, but I don't see a second term Trump White House reversing its position on Paris, right? Unless you have, you know, a pretty significant turnover in staff, and then you had this sort of maybe potentially this climate trade piece that provided a political argument for sort of rejoining Paris. But there's still, you know, unfortunately, there's still a lot of lack of education on what Paris is, what it's not. You still have some people who will argue that that you can't change your NDC downward. You can't. Another argument that I've heard before. You can't dismiss the possibility that environmentalists will come in and litigate on the issue, take you to court because of your NDC, or nationally determined contribution or pledge. I don't think any of that's, you know, a real problem. But you still have people who think that it is. So, you know, so getting Republicans in general more comfortable with the Paris framework is a real educational challenge. And then now you're even hearing these different arguments from some Republicans saying that we shouldn't belong to an international agreement if it allows other countries to increase their emissions. So what I find really interesting about that point is that it certainly reflects a shift in how we've thought about international climate change policy here in the United States. But again, because people recognize that we're on this decarbonization trend, then it's kind of a natural sort of, it's not a difficult leap to come to the conclusion, well, why are we part of an agreement that allows other countries to increase their emissions? So I do think that it could potentially result in a real sort of change in U.S. policy, again, towards international climate mitigation. But thank you.
Great. It's complicated.
It is.
A lot to digest there. Well, David, how would you, from what you know, how would you characterize Biden's plan for international climate issues? How is it different from what's been done before? And specifically, how would that plan impact the U.S.'s relationship with Latin America?
Sure, no, happy to answer. I just have to say that Dave gave a very charitable interpretation of how the president's motivation on climate change. I'm not sure it's all about Kyoto, and I don't know if he's very staff driven. Some of it's belief in the science or otherwise. But I would also say that while many US operators are low carbon and very clean, I think Wood Mackenzie has done a study, grading producers. The amount of flaring in the US puts the US at the bottom of the scale when it comes to sort of emissions per barrel. So we're in some very bad company with people who do a tremendous amount of flaring, and I think that's fixable. And we could easily be the best, but we're not there yet. The Vice President's plan on climate at the international level is to raise ambitions, to accelerate the energy transition and protect the planet. He understands that the US has been in and out of Kyoto and in and out of Paris, and that the only way to have credibility at the international level is to have your house in order here at home. And that's what his Build Back Better plan is about. That's what net zero by 2050, zero power emissions by 2035 are all about. We've got to have our own NDC. He's going to have to be out of the box pretty quickly to get it done by Glasgow. And it's going to have to be credible. Otherwise, no one's going to listen to us at the international level. It's going to have a big focus on innovation and technology. I think Dave is right. Absolutely that is the key to the pathway going forward. And it's going to have a nationalistic bent to it. He wants a lot of the stuff, whether it's wind turbines or whatever it is, to be built in the US and built with union labor. And if the Democrats take the Senate and you get, sort of a $2 trillion infrastructure bill, there's going to be a lot of jobs. It's why the AFL-CIO and all these unions have endorsed him, because this will be a huge creator, and they hope to make things which we could then export to the rest of the region. It's going to involve very serious attention to Central America, the Caribbean, all of the Americas, to be on board on this climate initiative. And it's going to be trying to help them accelerate their NDCs and their own pathways on the energy transition. We've talked about Mexico and Brazil, which I think will be challenges on this, but we will have this common interest in promoting economic prosperity and low carbon. And I think, as one of the questioners in the Q&A asked, if they see that the US is serious about doing it here, we're putting money into it, we're holding ourselves to a higher standard, we're implementing it, then I think they're going to believe this is going to happen overseas. If we're in a world where the US is not in Paris, it's going to be a very fragmented world and very disaggregated. And I think the hard part for the Biden administration will be if they win the presidency, but they don't take the Senate. And you may not have very much money to deal with, and you're dealing by executive order. It's going to be a harder pathway to do that. But I think things like mission innovation, that kind of collaboration, I think will continue. This is not going to be the climate edition of My Way or the Highway. This is going to be a partnership effort and a collaborative effort, and it's about finding common cause and common interests. That's how you do diplomacy, climate diplomacy and regular diplomacy. And I think that's how the Biden administration is going to lead. I think that's how they're going to engage the hemisphere.
Great, very interesting. Well, I have some questions from the audience.
Can I make one quick point?
Sure.
So David was talking about the McKinsey study. There was we had DOE, National Energy Technology Laboratory, NETL, they're in West Virginia and Pennsylvania. They released a study last year that looked at GHG life cycle production and compared it to, say, for example, Russian pipeline gas into Europe. And what they found that Russian pipeline gas into Europe is 40% plus more GHG intensive than US LNG shipped from the Gulf Coast to Europe. And the numbers for China were even worse, right? It was almost 50% more GHG intensive. So yes, I mean, I definitely agree with the fact that more methane leakage, is a problem. But again, when you're comparing it to methane leakage in, say, Russia, it's far worse than what we have here. But this could certainly be corrected if you integrated a climate and trade piece and sort of accounted for GHG impacts, right? That's it.
When I said we were in there with bad company, that's the company I was referring to. Yeah, we're in there with Russia, China, probably Nigeria and Iraq.
They're far worse than we are, though.
Yeah, we can do
not
better.
The worst. Well, let me go to this specific. It's a specific question on Venezuela, actually from the president of the Hydrocarbons Association in Venezuela. So the question is, do you expect the Trump administration not to renew the licenses for American companies operating in Venezuela, which expire in December? And I guess we could talk about what would happen with those licenses under either scenario of election outcomes. So David, maybe we should start with you. Do you have any comments on that?
Dave Banks, I hope he's he understands his colleagues.
So it's a good question. I'd probably put the probability being higher for renewal. Yeah, but to be honest, I haven't thought a tremendous amount about that one question. But so that's just kind of my gut reaction to it.
There probably would be renewal.
Yeah, more likely than not.
Mm-hmm. Okay. David, do you want to comment?
Well, I'll be curious to see what the administration's approach is on Venezuela after the election and Florida's results are in. So I think a lot of the policy has been driven that way. The ability of U.S. companies to operate or do much of anything in Venezuela is already, pretty severely restricted. I would hope that they would not kick them out and to give the chance for some diplomacy to operate, even if they're frankly not able to do anything other than hold on to their assets. I think we still want to hold out the hope that there can be a transition in Venezuela. And if so, we really don't need the Russians and the Chinese running the country, or we will have won the battle and lost the war. So, we'll see, but it'll certainly be their call.
Right. I agree with that.
Yeah. So for context, for those who don't know, I mean, essentially those licenses, there's nothing being produced. But if they are forced out, if the U.S. companies are forced out by sanctions, then, those assets could be expropriated and handed to another company. And then another question that we have is kind of a broader question. Currently, the U.S. posture regarding current and future energy development favors all energy sources, including fossil fuels. Some say the US is behind Europe in efforts to take action on the energy transition. And this lack of leadership could impact the urgency with which Latin American governments embrace policies for a greener future. So could either of the, or both of the panelists comment, I guess, on, how the US's position vis-a-vis others and whether that has an impact on Latin American governments and their decisions to take action?
Let me offer 3 thoughts on that. I mean, I think, first, no question for the US to be listened to abroad, we'd have to have our house in order at home when it comes to climate. And Europe is ahead of the United States when it comes to putting in place policies to accelerate the energy transition. No question about it, putting in more money, and they have firmer targets. And a Biden administration is going to try and do the same for the United States. With respect to hydrocarbon production, though, I mean, Europe's is declining anyway. And so it's a declining asset base. So that's not really a relevant comparison. And people should not, in my view, misinterpret or wrongly interpret what the Biden administration is saying. They're not talking about shutting down US oil and gas production. They're talking about no new leasing on federal lands. They're talking about regulating methane. They're talking about not building infrastructure if you don't need it or unless you account for the impacts of it. And they're talking about creating incentives to use other cleaner fuels, renewable energy in power generation, and making cars and vehicles more efficient, not ending fracking, not ending exports, none of that. So, there may be, US companies like everybody else may have to compete for a share of a shrinking pie in which the low cost, low carbon operator will be the winner. But that's what that's about. And I think as we talk to other countries in the hemisphere, we will also be encouraging them to be, low cost and low carbon, and encouraging our companies to behave responsibly when they're producing down there. And that should be a consistent message, with a kind of an approach that has integrity, both moral and ethical integrity, as well as policy integrity.
Mm-hmm. Dave, what do you think?
Look, I mean, working on climate and energy policy for, I don't know, since I guess 2004 now, there certainly has been an evolution in sort of democratic policymaking circles on climate. It hasn't been that long ago when we had a lot of Democratic support for addressing fossil fuel emissions through technology, through carbon capture. I think that there's a growing number of environmentalists and, again, Democratic climate policymakers that would argue, and I certainly hear this on the Hill a lot, that would argue that, look, you know, this is a fantasy. This technology approach is fantasy. We've been talking about it forever. Hasn't happened. We got to keep the fossil fuels in the ground. And I think, you know, even though that's not where Vice President Biden is, certainly where a lot of folks are on the Democratic side, again, in the climate policy making space. I think how this plays out internationally is probably a continuation of where the Obama administration was in the last few years with the multilateral development banks, and just the Democratic Party in general with restrictions on XM, on I guess probably if they got the Senate back, they'd be in a better position to do all that, even greater restrictions on XM and DFC, et cetera. But also, again, using the development banks to continue that approach. So, you know, if you are a developing economy that's looking to use fossil fuels continue to use fossil fuels in its mix, I think you have to anticipate a much tougher line on fossil fuels within international fora if you have a Biden administration.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Absolutely.
Well, since we have 5 more minutes, I will ask one other question that I had in mind. I was wondering if we could talk about Brazil, because, you know, we kind of talked about most of the other major subregions or countries in Latin America. I think Brazil on energy, you know, it's obviously not as close ties as with Mexico. Brazilian exports mostly go to China, but there are a couple of very important issues. Brazil is you know, as the largest economy in the region, just our relationship with Brazil is very important. The issue concerns over the Amazon have become more and more relevant and can't be ignored. Even I think came up in the debate. I think the one time Latin America came up in the presidential debates was something about the Amazon. But I also wonder, you know, in terms of the energy relationship, there are a lot of US companies with assets in the oil and gas sector. So I was just wondering, you know, basically if you could each comment, you know, under each of the outcome scenarios, what would our relationship with Brazil be like on some of these issues that I mentioned? Would there be any changes? So I guess we could start with Dave.
With Dave.
Who's Dave Banks? I'm saying
Bad
Dave,
Dave, right? Yeah, I don't. I have to admit that I don't track the Brazil-U.S. bilateral relationship that closely. But again, I mean, I would be surprised if there were any sort of major shift in sort of approach as it pertains to energy. I mean, look, there's always going to be the controversial point over ethanol, right? Because of the politics here and the politics there. You know, I think in the past, during the Bush administration, I don't know if the Obama team sort of followed through and kept it, but there's certainly in the Bush 43 administration, there was this sort of concept or idea that we would sort of form an ethanol alliance with Brazil and sort of promote it in sort of global markets. I don't see that happening just because ethanol is not as popular as it once was, sort of across the political spectrum here in the United States. But again.
Yeah, but thank you for raising that, because that's also a really important energy related part of the relationship between the US and Brazil, the rather contentious issue of ethanol trade. David Goldwyn.
Sure. Well, like all of our major power relationships, we've got a broad relationship with Brazil. We've got security, we've got trade, we've got, you know, investment. You know, the energy piece of this, when in my time, we had the US-Brazil biofuels dialogue, which mostly talked about the promotion of biofuels in third countries. And we basically left the United States and Brazil alone. And it was about sharing technology and promoting standards and things like that. I don't think the U.S. energy investment, investments in Brazil need a lot of federal government nurture. They're working pretty well. Brazil respects contracts. They respect the rule of law. They're going to work just fine. The Biden administration is not going to promote them. Biden administration is not going to oppose them either. It's going to be focused on climate, and it's going to take some creative diplomacy to find what it will take to encourage Brazil to find it in Brazil's interests, as it should be at a global level, to return to, if not raise, its climate ambitions and enforce them. And that might be, maybe ethanol ends up being a piece of that. I think we'll have to figure that out. But that part of the relationship will be challenging, but other parts of the relationship will be fine. So I think, there's no question Brazil is important. And President Biden, or Vice President Biden, sorry, wishful thinking there, Vice President Biden called out the Brazilians on burning in the Amazon. And it's a serious issue, and we're not the only country that's going to do that. But we're going to have to do more than wag our finger at them. We're going to have to find some creative way to encourage them to take a different course.
Yeah. Well, we're just at time to wrap up. I think this was a really interesting discussion. We covered a lot of ground, a lot of different issues. And it was really interesting to hear your, really deep insights from all of your experience with the different administrations. So I really want to thank both of you for joining us today. It was a great discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
It was great. Thank you.